All right, well, thank you, Vince and the organizers, for inviting me here. It's my pleasure to speak to you today on this unpublished work. My name is Matthew Phillips, and I'm from HRL Laboratories. So we're very much interested in this idea that tDCS has applications outside of the lab, both in terms of training and cognitive enhancement. And we were very much inspired by Vince's study on the threat detection task and wanted to take this to a different level, procedural and skill learning. I'll be talking to you today about. So our hypothesis for this study that I'm going to describe to you is that the spatiotemporal modulation of neural activity within the brain during learning can accelerate or improve procedural skill acquisition. And this is based on a couple of tenets in the literature. So advances in neuroimaging have allowed researchers to map the different states along the learning process within skill acquisition. This is an example of a golfer who was scanned in an fMRI. We were able to see different brain regions light up and actually regions change as that individual learns and perfects their skill. Advances in non-invasive transcranial neurostimulation, as we've heard today and yesterday, from the high-definition varieties developed by Maron Bixham and colleagues, allow spatial targeting on a novel and unprecedented scale, as well as the new flavors of DCAC and random noise stimulation that can allow for temporal targeting. So our goal in this was to measure the mechanisms of accelerated learning in a realistic environment. And HRL is owned by Boeing and General Motors, so the application was pilot training. And our hypothesis in this, looking at the literature, was that frontal midline theta power, both in attention and in working memory, is a potential mechanism for procedural learning. And we're very much inspired by the work of the late, great Raja Parasuraman and colleagues in the sense, assess, and augment cycle. So let's get to this study. So I'm going to describe to you today two experiments and the results from that, again, which haven't been published. So the first experiment was really inspired by this Vince's study that you heard about yesterday in terms of mapping the different states so we could apply the stimulation in an informed manner. So we were measuring the neural and behavioral states during a flight performance task. We had a very basic one of calm versus turbulent flight conditions, and I'll show some videos on the next slide what this looks like. But it's basically this flight simulator that subjects were engaged in. They were trained up in sort of basic aircraft controls, and then they were instructed to maintain constant and level flight across a variety of conditions, both in calm and turbulent weather. We also did this sort of classical end-back task, also with a flavor for flight simulation. These airplanes would appear in essentially this 3x3 tic-tac-toe grid, and we assessed the working memory capacity, again, within the same experiment with simultaneous tDCS. So that was experiment 2. We applied tDCS to novices during the learning process and measured the skill acquisition performance in both the end-back and the flight simulator task. There were 4 experimental groups, a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation and sham group, as well as a motor stimulation and sham group. Each group had 7 subjects each, and these were double-blind. We brought subjects in 4 consecutive days, so we were interested in the learning process over days and how that occurred. So subjects came in, and the experimental setup was a simultaneous neuroimaging of functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which I won't report on. We're still analyzing that data. The EEG and the HD tDCS, along with electroculograms and behavioral data collection from the flight simulator. So these are what the montages look like for these groups, and these are a little bit complicated, but I just wanted to say that the predicted targets came from the Soterix HD targets for the maximum focality montages for right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, left motor cortex, all right-handed subjects. And then where we could, we basically aligned the EEG with the established 1020 grid system on the head cap, and then had the near-infrared sources and detectors over the dorsolateral and motor cortex. The predicted field intensities at the targets were about half a volt per meter. And if you're interested, I can share these montages with you later. So this is what the actual first experiment looked like. This is the calm versus turbulent flight conditions. subjects in the flight simulator. And you can see that it's very easy to maintain level flight within the calm flight conditions, where you see here on the attitude indicator, it's very difficult to maintain level flight in the turbulent condition. And this is reflected in the behavior. So the red trials here are individual trials from the turbulent flight, and the blue are the calm flight. This is in terms of the heading of the aircraft, the roll of the aircraft. This was an altitude task where they were instructed to climb 1,000 feet, and then the constant latitude. So what we observed for this in general across subjects was that the turbulent flight conditions produced a larger behavioral variability, not terribly unexpected given the nature of the scenario. We then turned to the neuroimaging data and said, is there a neurocorrelate? Can we actually predict what state that the subject was in based on a neural activity pattern that we observed? And that was true for both the electroencephalogram imaging and for the near-infrared spectroscopy. So this is the power spectral distribution in the turbulent versus calm conditions, and these are average, so this x-axis isn't really time, it's averaged across the whole duration of the experiment. And you can see that in the turbulent conditions, there's a greater deal of theta power, especially required within that experimental scenario. In the near-infrared data, we saw greater bold activation within the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well, and the group average. So that this told us that the calm conditions really did require, in fact, less brain activity. It was an easier task, both reflected in terms of the EEG and the near-infrared data. Our hypothesis was that there was more attention that was just required during the turbulent condition to actually maintain that flight performance. So now the second experiment, where we brought in subjects across multiple days. And here what I'm showing is the heat maps from the different power bands. So this is a theta and this is the alpha heat map in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex group. And one way to kind of get around this idea of simultaneous EEG and tDCS is if you look at multiple days and do a group independent component analysis, you can actually observe the change, because we were interested in learning across days, that this was the identical setup essentially across days, so that this t-statistic map actually reflected the change in learning across days, independent of whatever noise sources the tDCS electrodes induced on the EEG channels. So we observed in the theta band an increase in this frontal midline theta. This was an experience-related increase, so this occurred across multiple days, which potentially could indicate an increase in working memory processing. We looked at the behavior. This is the NBAC task, and we saw about a threefold increase in the learning rate in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex stimulation group over either the sham group or the two motor groups. When we looked at the alpha band, we saw this increase in power that's indicative of the stimulation, and then a experience-related decrease when we looked across days in this central parietal power in the alpha band, which could potentially indicate an increase in working memory processing as well within that group that has this behavioral correlate. And finally, the landing task, where subjects were lined up for a runway. They observed multiple trials of this, were brought in again across 4 days. We observed a similar performance benefit from actually now both the DLPFC stimulation group and the motor stimulation group. And this shouldn't come terribly as a surprise because this task involves both cognitive decision-making, understanding the flight controls, as well as motor performance, motor tracking behavior, and using the yoke and the throttle appropriately to line up with the runway and eventually touch down. So the behavioral metric here is essentially the G-force at touchdown. It's how hard that airplane hits the ground when the runway, when the wheels touch the runway. And we saw that significant increase in both the DLPFC stimulation group and the motor stimulation group over their sham groups. When we looked at the EEG neuroimaging data, we saw this increase in power near the stimulation location as we had before. Within the individual days, some of that might be artifactual. However, this experience-related increase in the medial frontal theta band and a decrease in left parietal power was indicative of an increase in working memory and possibly like a perceptual, tactile, or a proprioceptive processing performance increase. Within the theta band in the motor group, we saw this increase in left parietal power. This was experience related across the days as well. and potentially could indicate a greater ease of performance increase. This is a task that, again, requires both motor and decision-making performance. So we're currently kind of analyzing the data, trying to work out, tease out the different contributions. If you look at, for example, the glide slope of the aircraft as it goes down, did the subject, touch the runway earlier, perhaps later? So this tracking behavior across the glide slope is indicative of the performance of the landing as well as the G-force. So that's in process. To conclude, the transcranial direct current stimulation applied to the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex improved both general, as has been reported before, in working memory and back task performance, and a very specific and applicable, such as airplane landing performance in procedural skill acquisition. The potential mechanisms we saw in the neuroimaging data, EEG only so far, was this increase in midline frontal theta power. And the future directions are we're currently running a 6-month follow-up retention study to test if those abilities were in fact retained. And then again, analyzing the concomitant signatures such as the oculogram and the NIRS. And happy to take any questions.